Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2.
Good morning. We will just wait for people to get in and get settled. I'm going to say for everybody can sit wherever they want. We would not be passing laws to decide where you can sit and what you can do. But I will say we're building such a wonderful community at this conference. And so I think the closer that we are physically, particularly in a setting like this, a conversation, it would be wonderful to have people down in these front rows. If that's possible for you, you may not want to, you may have a better sight line, but if you can come down and sit in the front, that would be great. And we'll get started in a few minutes. Good morning, everyone. Yep. All right. We're warming up. Yeah, I'll say that's acceptable. Okay. So welcome to day 2 of this incredible conference. Yesterday was just so exciting. The conversations were amazing. The teachers we heard from at the end of the day yesterday were just extraordinary. That is going to be my takeaway going home at what we heard and thought about there. Here we're in this panel digging deeper into the question of teaching uncomfortable history in Florida and the nation, past and present. And I'm delighted to be introducing people and then disappearing over there. So let me first introduce KEITHA Nelson, who will be moderating and asking the questions. Ms. Nelson is a 19-year news veteran, currently serving as co-anchor of Good Morning Jacksonville. She is driven to serve the Jacksonville community that she has called home for nearly a decade. During a time as a member of the First Coast News team, KEITHA helped lead coverage of the major hurricanes that have devastated First Coast communities, including Hurricanes Matthew and Irma. KEITHA has been recognized for her work in journalism as well as her community involvement, having earned numerous community service awards, winning an award in excellence in broadcast journalism from Women in Media. She has also contributed to team awards, including both an Edward R. Murrow and a Peabody for Hurricane Katrina coverage, and an Emmy. KEITHA has covered breaking news stories across the country and has gained market-exclusive interviews with national figures and newsmakers, including leading coverage of the, Camilla Mobley story. She enjoys sharing the stories of underserved communities and helping to preserve the voices of historic figures. KEITHA is passionate about telling little-known stories in creative, eye-opening ways. She helped create a Black History series that incorporates local artists and trailblazers called Vivid Hues, Stories of Black History. She's involved with many Jacksonville area organizations, lending her voice and time and donating countless hours to local groups. She serves on the board of a local nonprofit called Hope at Hand, which provides art and poetry therapy to at-risk populations. KEITHA is a graduate of Nichols State University, where she attended school on a track and field scholarship. She's a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She is also married with 2 children, twins, Journey and Trey. She shared her difficult journey to motherhood publicly in a 6-part series on Good Morning Jacksonville and First Coast News on their YouTube page, where she opened up about refusing to suffer in silence while undergoing in vitro fertilization. She says that was the most rewarding series she's delved into during her career, knowing that it helped families across the First Coast and beyond. So an incredibly rich array of experience and contributions that I'm sure will inform her questions on this panel. Dr. J. Michael Butler, who you all know well at this point, but he hasn't actually had a formal introduction yet. He is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History here at Flagler College, where he has taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading peer-reviewed academic publications, such as the Journal of American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, the Florida Historical Quarterly, and Southern Cultures. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the Black freedom struggle. He teaches a number of classes on these topics, and he has spoken to dozens of teachers and community groups about the civil rights movement. And maybe he'll share his experience from, I guess it was over a year ago now, in the course of our discussions. Professor David Blight has a CV so extensive that it would take away our time, I think, to introduce him fully, but I think many of you know him as the Pulitzer Prize winning historian biographer of Frederick Douglass, someone who has written numerous works about historical memory and commemoration, particularly of the African-American freedom struggle, Civil War, and Reconstruction. He is the founder, I believe, and the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University. And he is also, we are thrilled, those of us who are OAH members, he is the incoming president of the Organization of American Historians. So wonderful panel. I will get off the stage and just say, I can't wait to hear from you.
Guys hearing me okay? You know, I'm sitting next to this Pulitzer Prize winning author next to me, and my bio is way longer than his. Something was wrong with that, huh? Like, wait a minute, can we get to? It's a little embarrassing. But how's everyone feeling this morning on a Saturday morning? Pretty good? The conference has been going well so far? Yes, enjoying. I had a chance to speak with an educator on my way in, and she was telling me it's so nice to have this open forum to talk about something that folks aren't openly discussing in forums such as this. That's what we're here for. We're here to have a candid conversation. So feel free, because after we talk up here, we're going to open the mic and you're going to ask whatever questions you have, and we're going to talk about some topics that are a little uncomfortable. Is that okay? We're going to do something, you know. And I spoke with someone recently this weekend. She was telling me that teachers use a term called with-itness. Have you heard that? With-itness? No? The ability to handle a crowd if they get a little rowdy. I've got with-itness. And I know they look a little rowdy up here, but we're going to keep them in line, right? They're going to behave yourselves today. We'll see how it goes. Wicked, why not? With-itness. With-itness. All right. Professor Blight, let's jump right into this, because I have heard you speak before, and your passion is apparent when it comes to education. Before all of this, before that impressive resume of yours, you were a teacher, a public school teacher in Michigan. So at heart, you understand. So I want to know your reaction to see what we are seeing right now, all of these limitations, restrictions being put in place when it comes to educating our youth.
Thank you, Keitha. Hey, there we go. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. A good conference is the one that they come back on Saturday morning. You know, it's such a long story, but the short of it is, I got out of college in 1971. Few of you know this. Apologies. All I ever wanted to do was to teach history since I could remember. It didn't necessarily come from my family. It came from teachers. I had two great high school teachers. One who taught Western Civ, one who taught U.S. history. I even forgave her when she took me out in the hall to tell me that my older brother, who was 3 years older, was brilliant, and she expected that of me, which is terrible teaching. Don't ever do that to a kid. I don't even fully remember how and why. The past, you know, the stories. Maybe it was just stories. I love stories. But anyway, it was 1971 when I started teaching. If you know your history, folks, this, you know, this is immediately post 60s. Everything was up for grabs, the curriculum, and we really messed it up. I was privileged to teach with a group of people who were mostly young Turks, although there were some older folk too who were good teachers. And it was a prosperous time in Flint, Michigan. The news about Flint in recent times has been terrible, but it was I taught in a brand new high school. You know, a measure of a city that's prosperous is it's building new schools. Brand new high school. And we had a big social studies department, fairly diverse for that era. And we were given kind of carte blanche, I think inappropriately, by the administration to just teach whatever we wanted. And we did. And we created a course in Black history. There were 2 or 3 of us. We didn't necessarily know what we were doing. But I took the first ever African-American history course. I don't think it was called that, at Michigan State, where I was an undergraduate in either 68 or 69. I've written 2 books about historical memory, and I've learned, if nothing else, never trust your memory. But I did take that course. It was taught by Leslie Rout, who was African American, but his field was Latin American history. He was an expert on Brazil and Juan Perón. That was his field, but I think they probably told him, Les, you're black, teach this course. And it was fabulous. I had learned no black history per se in high school. It just wasn't there. I mean, yeah, we knew slavery caused the Civil War, I think. It just wasn't any. You know, it just wasn't. I still would defend the teacher I had. She was terrific. She built a sense of history in us, and she taught us what a document was. Although she never, I mean, at least once a week, she told us she went to Columbia University and studied with Richard Hofstadter, which I thought was cool at the time. But my God, do you have to tell your students every day? But anyway, so here we were in the early 70s, and then we were hit with the busing issue. Flint didn't create busing, but it created magnet schools, and it was all huge crisis. Do we have court-ordered busing, or do we have magnet schools, and so on and so on? And I was on, you know, community committees about that stuff. But mostly we were trying to teach kind of the new histories as best we could without adequate resources, although the school system did buy some books. I knew one book on slavery, Kenneth Stamp's The Peculiar Institution, written in 1955. And I got the library to order, I don't know, 100 copies of that. And I got them to order probably 100 copies of whatever edition it was, of John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. And that's kind of where we started. And then we had another little book called, oh God, Eyewitness to History or something. It was a collection of biographies of Black Americans. You know, the biographical approach. You'd get 2 pages on Douglass and 2 pages on Henry Highland Garnet and 2 pages on Du Bois or something. But that's what we had. And I wouldn't even want to know how badly we were teaching that at the time. But this is what we were doing. And I loved it. I mean, at times, when you're in your 20s, and some teachers here are still in their 20s, you have energy. And it was an around-the-clock job. We had all kinds of after-school stuff. The Flint was fortunate at that time. I'm saying this because this is what's possible in a public school system in a major industrial city. Flint had the Mott Foundation. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Mott was the largest stockholder in General Motors. He helped create Chevrolet. He had a mansion house in the middle of town, and he drove a little Corvair. But the Mott Foundation sponsored all kinds of stuff in the Flint schools. So we had this kind of private philanthropy and a public school system that the city supported. And I was able to, for 5 years, I took students from a high school in Flint, mostly working class kids, on field trips in the Midwest. You always call it out east. I took them to Civil War sites for 5 days. I did a bicentennial field trip in 1976, a week-long tour from Boston to Philadelphia to Washington. You know, taking 50 kids on a bus will either kill you or inspire you for a week, and both. You know, you go without sleep. You're always worried about which one's trying to go out and find beer. But it is possibly the most important teaching I've ever done. And I've been privileged now to teach at all kinds of fancy places. But I still hear from some of those people. I won't tell you how old they are now. They tell me about their grandkids. They see me on some documentary and they say, I was on your field trip in 1974. You may not remember me, but here are pictures of my grandkids. You know, thanks a lot. But there's nothing quite as cool as that, because they remember standing on the field at Gettysburg or standing in front of Independence Hall or wherever. And they don't remember probably anything they learned in the classroom, but they remember that. Some of them have never seen a hill in their lives. And then they saw a mountain and in the Blue Ridge, and they were stunned. So teaching to me was the only thing I ever wanted to do. I felt lucky I got to do it. But To be honest, I asked that question about burnout yesterday. It was yesterday, wasn't it? Yeah. Because I remember burnout, and I remember Friday afternoons, and I remember the bar we always went to. And I did a master's degree, and then I'll stop. I did a master's degree part-time in history, not in education. It took me 3.5 years. I did it one course at a time at Michigan State. It's an hour away from Flint. And they offered a lot of seminars at about 4 or 5 p.m. for people like me. They had a lot of MA students. And that was my path into realizing, ooh, research. This is interesting. This is fun. I love archives. And I wrote my first term papers. And the first 2 of which I actually got published in Popular History magazine. There used to be a magazine called American History Illustrated. I can still remember exactly where I was holding that in my hands, like a newborn. Wow, I published something. I plagiarized it all out of a biography of Charles something. No, not all of it, some of it. But, you know, it was a process. I was beginning to realize, hey, this is a bigger thing. Maybe I can be a scholar. Who knows? And then in my 7th year of teaching, I said, what the hell? As a lark, I applied to 2 places. Michigan. I went to Michigan State for 2 degrees, and my mentor there said, don't come here for your PhD. Try somewhere else. I applied to Michigan and I applied to Wisconsin. Michigan didn't take me. The bastards. My brother went to Michigan, and I've always forgiven him. And I applied to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin took me. So I did a PhD at Wisconsin. And then, you know, I became, I guess, whatever we are, we're academics or something. But teaching and its place in our country and in the world and in the public, the place of this thing called public education is the one thing I've cared about more than anything else in my life. And that's why this issue that we're here talking about, all these issues we're talking about, are extremely important to me. I think it was Brent yesterday who said, you know, public schools are our democracy. The public school is the most democratic institution I think Americans have ever created. If you just look at, you know, our Constitution isn't all that democratic. If you've looked at the Electoral College and the nature of the Senate and look at it today. But that public school, it had a rocky beginning, and it has an up and down roller coaster history, and it's been full of inequality, god awful inequality. But in the 20th century, and especially post-World War II, the public school and then the public university, and I have nothing against private, I've now taught in 4 private colleges and universities, private colleges. But the public school invented not only the middle class, it invented a new kind of democracy. My brother and I grew up totally working class. My dad worked at AC Sparkplug, part of General Motors. My mother was a secretary. They were fabulous people, but totally working class mentalities. All they knew was their sons were going to go to college because they didn't. And they had that value. But in post-World War II, the 40s, 50s, 60s was the giant boom time of public universities and of thriving public school systems in parts of the country that supported it. And it's the time when teachers' unions exploded. And I was a member of a teacher union in Flint. We struck 3 times in my 7 years. We struck every 2 years. We knew the system was doing fine. We knew the city was doing fine. We knew they had money. We went on strike every 2 years, out on the picket line. One of them lasted 5 weeks. Every strike we had, we went back under court injunction and got the same damn 2% raise or something like that. But we had a very active teachers union. And that was my first experience with, I mean, all my uncles and relatives were in the UAW. I mean, I knew something about unions, but actually being in one. So, you know, that's why I care about this.
You know what? You said something that struck out to me is that you have students that kept in touch with you over all those years. We've all had educators that stick with us, right? That stick in our minds. And a part of education, I'm sure a lot of you will agree, is not just to teach students how to pass tests, but how to teach them how to think. Is that under attack right now, Professor Butler?
Yes. In a word, it sure seems that way. And I would not have answered that question the same way 18 months ago. I can share the personal stories that Dr. Blight, I can echo those stories in many ways, about the transformative impact of education. You know, we heard Thomas Paine yesterday quoted often, the mind once enlightened can not return again to darkness. And that's a philosophy that I have experienced firsthand. It's why I teach what I teach. It's why I do what I do. And I had the luxury of being a white guy from South Alabama with this accent, teaching African-American history and the civil rights movement, that sort of had me oblivious to the reality of something my friend Hassan Jeffries told me one day. Mike, the very nature of what we teach makes it political. He had faced restrictions and pushback and visceral hate that I had not experienced. One of the greatest privileges that I have is to work with our teachers groups and to work with community groups. I'll never turn down, I never have, an invitation to speak to the people who are doing this on the front lines. That has brought me into contact with organizations like the National Council for History Education and the Florida Council for History Education. And they had invested a lot of money into a teacher training program for a variety of different topics. Long story short, in January of 2022, I was a part of the lead scholar, which is much more highfalutin than it really is for me, right? But I had the opportunity to organize.
You do the syllabus.
It means I do that's exactly right. It means that I had the PowerPoints. So the seminar was titled for that day, The Long Civil Rights Movement. And it was broken down into three components. It was the long civil rights movement, which the emphasis is on helping teachers understand so that they convey to their students that the civil rights movement didn't start with the Montgomery bus boycott or Brown versus Board, but it's to go back into Reconstruction, because as we know, David, Reconstruction explains everything. So
Increasingly so.
Exactly. So the long movement, the master narrative, which was roughly 1955 to 1965, and the movement continues 1965 to the present, with using Escambia County and the Florida story as sort of an example to share with teachers on how history happens, sometimes literally in your backyard and you're oblivious to it, but it connects with students. So I've said all of that to say, working with the fine partners at NCHE, working with the teacher who actually brought all of this into being in a way that was digestible for teachers. We had everything set up and ready to go. And 3 days before the session, that county in Central Florida let NCHE know that in light of the conversations that we are having at the state level about critical race theory, we are going to have to postpone the seminar series. CRT does not stand for civil rights training. And critical race theory was conflated with Black history. And at that moment, I realized we're in a different world. And that, to me, Ms. Nelson, as we look back, Brant had a similar comment about how the death of George Floyd galvanized and mobilized. For me, that was yet another example in the long movement of why what we teach is more than just academic, big A and little a, that it's literal life and death. But for me, that was an indication that the stakes have been raised, that it is a new world, and that the freedom and privilege that I have, being who I am, where I'm from, teaching this history, now held up a mirror and said, are you who you think you are? You talk about the rights and the stories and the sacrifices that people you know of and have talked to have lived, but you haven't experienced yourself. Are you going to then live your principles and teach topics that are even more important today than they have been during my lifetime? And that was the transformative part of the experience. So is there an attack? I would say yes, not because of any political orientation, but because my right to teach teachers in a school district that services underserviced students was taken away from them by those who may not have been acting in the best interests of the children that they claim to serve.
I want to get into the weeds a little bit right now. Florida's new K through 12 social studies curriculum getting a lot of criticism, a lot of attention. PragerU, you guys are familiar with those videos? Professor Blight, you're familiar with Frederick Douglass, right? You know a little bit about him, just a little bit.
I keep trying to forget. They won't let me.
I want to talk about the way he's depicted in one of those videos. I'm sure you've seen it. You've all seen it. It's all over social media. This is a quote. "I'm certainly not okay with slavery, but the founding fathers made a compromise to achieve something great, the making of the United States." What's your take on that, sir?
Yeah, well, I hadn't seen that until I kept hearing from people, you got to look at this video. I think Daisha, you sent it to me too. And so I looked at it, and you know, my first reaction is to laugh, but then you realize, and then I began to learn more about this Prager company and how influential they are and how much money they make on these things. I mean, it's appalling. It depicts Douglass as this middle of the road advocate of the great compromises in the Constitution and trying to make these two little children who are both white, aren't they? I think yeah, they appear so in the cartoon, feel good about the founding, about the country. Now, I mean, it's not even enough to say that's historically nonsense, but it's, and then isn't that the one that also depicts William Lloyd Garrison?
Yes.
Yeah, Garrison is used as the white villain. And this is just classic melodrama. Garrison has to be the villain who, yeah, that's right. That's the one where Douglass says, you know, William Lloyd Garrison wouldn't accept any compromise. He was just so doctrinaire. And on. Douglass was doctrinaire too. In fact, he learned how to do it from Garrison. Anyway, but what do you say about stuff like that? It's potent, well produced. Animated films, very expensive to make. And I mean, it's just, it peddles, but what it does is, we talked about this a lot yesterday around here. What it does is it peddles this notion that, my children, American history's just fine. You'll be all right. We have a little conflicts. Oh, we had this thing called, I certainly was opposed to slavery. Certainly. Douglass doesn't need a certainly. I mean, they might have put into the script, I was a slave. Anyway, so, but it peddles that notion that history's going to be history will make you all right. You know, don't worry about it. It's a safe place to go. People in the end always got along. They compromised. They made good deals, and you're going to be fine. You're going to sleep at night. Nonsense. History should wake us up at night. I mean, I'm not advocating nightmares, but
You're advocating waking up.
yeah,
Paying attention.
Oh, but then you're going to get called
Woke.
I don't even, the etymology of that. Didn't the left create it though? And then the left creates all kinds of language and the right appropriates it and wins with it.
It's taken on different
Yeah, I know.
meanings.
It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
crazy.
It's now a word that good faith actors use to shame the compassionate.
Whoa.
That's what woke means.
Say that again.
It is a word that non-good faith actors now use to shame the compassionate.
I like that. That's good.
Put it down.
That's good.
Likes to flirt.
It's the key to the next Pulitzer.
Um,
By the way, let's check our P prizes at the door here. No, we don't have to worry about
Okay.
all that, all right?
kind of wear that with you. But Professor Butler, so with if you guys don't know, he is involved in a project with First Coast News with G.D. Blaylock. They've actually been to Vietnam to share these stories, really powerful stories, by the way. And recently on a trip, I believe in June, you went back. I heard about a conversation that gave me chills. I'm going to give you a quote of what he was told by, who was it that you were talking to there? Was it
Yeah, it was one of the tour guides who was with us for a period of 14 consecutive days.
Let me give you guys this quote and let it sink in. This is what he told him. In Vietnam, we can't teach what we want, and you can't either. That's what he told him. Is that not chilling to you?
I still get chills when you say that. One of the, I mean, the privileges of doing what I do is exactly what Dr. Blight mentioned, and that's having students have life-altering impact through something that I did, positively or negatively, I suppose. I have some students here, former students, so maybe it wasn't too bad. But leading study abroad courses over summers is something that I find incredibly rewarding. And it's related to the topics that we study, but it's also outside of my area of scholarly expertise, big S, B-E, right? Big E. And the Vietnam War is one of those topics. Well, you know, long story short, I've had the opportunity to teach this course about the Vietnam War. We study the American perspective, we study the timeline, then we flip the script and actually go to Vietnam and visit the places that we study and examine the power of storytelling in history from alternative perspectives. And when I say alternative perspectives, I mean the other side, the indigenous experience. And needless to say, it is different. And one of the things that our students were dealt with, one of the things that our tour guides were very careful in letting us know was there is a state-sponsored version of history that we have to teach. It's a narrative. It is, dare I say, Vietnamese exceptionalism. So when we are there and we're talking about these issues, I got to know the tour guide. We knew that our class they knew their stuff, and that opens up a lot of doors. And we have conversations about cultures and life and individual conversations about these things. And what is it that you study, Professor? And they were intrigued. And our guide, Mr. Tong, he wanted to know more about who we were. What do you do? I told him I had a website with articles and stuff. Oh, yes, please. I'm like, okay, whatever. Here you go, Tong. He actually read it. A few days later, he came to me and said, Mr. Mike, I read your articles. What a shame. We have the same problem. The state sponsors what we can teach. And for me, that was one of those, Miss Nelson, ice water over the head moments of, from the outside perspective, we want to teach a more robust story, so do you. We are limited by our Communist Party. You're limited by something else. We both face the same issues. And for me, that was a moment of absolute clarity and perspective.
Could I comment just briefly on that? That's profound, man. I've never been to Vietnam. My brother spent half his life studying the Vietnam War and always tells me to go. But anyway, in 1992, 93, I was in Germany, based in Munich on a Fulbright. But I spent a lot of time, it was only 2 years, 3 years after the wall goes down. So Germany was this laboratory for the bursting out of histories at that moment. I spent a lot of time touring around East Germany and other Eastern countries, Czech Republic, Hungary. Spent like 2 full days with a guy in Dresden who had been in effect a school superintendent, a teacher who becomes administrator superintendent. And they were just beginning to try to open up how to teach about anything but what had been the state-sponsored history, which was incredible East German and Soviet exceptionalism. But he told me a story I've never forgotten. He said, I've never been to the West. He had never gone to the West. His children had by then. He said, I've been to your country on maps. I said, what, really? He said, oh yeah. He started naming off all the state capitals. He started naming rivers. I've been to your country on maps. I know your country on maps. He even showed me one of his maps. And of course, then we got into this, and he spoke good English, which not all East Germans did. They had to learn Russian. But we had this interesting conversation because he thought, now is the time to have this thoroughly open, pluralistic American influence. And of course, here I am kind of telling, well, we got problems too. I'm trying to convince him that it isn't perfect in our country either right now. And, we just went through this thing called Reaganism. But he was not to be convinced that America wasn't the model, and he was so sweet and so interesting. I wasn't going to disabuse him entirely. I've been to your country on maps. And I thought, yeah, that's a start. I kept in touch with him a little while, but then we lost touch. That you make all these contacts everywhere and you just don't keep them all up. I wish I'd kept in touch with that guy. I always wondered what happened to his kids when they went west,
Reality hit him.
Probably. Who knows? They might be running German companies now for all I know. I don't know.
Our stories underscore something that I think is important. And it is really something that I try to share with students just as much as it is a country. America is an ideal. America is a symbol of something much bigger than one document, even though documents are important, primary sources, right? But America is an ideal. It is who we want to aspire to be. So when teaching this topic, when teaching Frederick Douglass or teaching Reverend H.K. Matthews and the Florida model, what teaching this history does more than any other topic that I think we can conceive of is that it demonstrates how we've progressed in becoming who this ideal is and simultaneously exposing how far we have to go to fulfill the ideal. So whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the former East Germany, or whether it's Florida today, history is not
quite a comparison there, actually. Did you catch that?
And that was unintentional.
Oh, okay.
For those of you watching elsewhere. But it really does underscore the fact that if history makes you feel good about yourself, I'm doing it wrong. It is about context. It's about progress, and it's also about truth. Truth that's told through primary sources. Don't trust me. Go to the sources that I use to help construct the narrative of America as a whole.
What happens when those sources aren't available because they've been banned?
That's a problem.
Yeah. So let me tell you guys, I'm clearly not an educator. I'm just a nosy journalist who just happens to be a little wolf. Like I'm involved in things I want to know. And I remember us getting these emails into the newsroom, these pictures of empty bookshelves in classrooms. You're like, what the heck is going on here? Then I started getting text messages and on Twitter, I said, what's happening? We start looking into it. We asked the governor because we're hearing book bans are going on. He's like, it's a hoax. It's not real. It's not happening. But I said, it's right here. We're seeing the pictures. We're talking to these educators. It's happening. And then there's this list that comes out. And on that list of banned books, Frederick Douglass, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. How do you feel about that, sir?
And where, this was in Jacksonville or just in the area?
Well, Jacksonville, somewhere in Jacksonville, all throughout Florida. I got some from Orlando as well, some pictures. Yeah.
So the narrative made a list of banned books in a school.
Well, Penn America's Index of School Book Bans.
Okay.
Your guy's book is included in that. sir.
Yeah. And Penn America has a great website on that, by the way, great banned books website. Okay, I'll try to comment on how crazy that is. I mean, it's the greatest of all slave narratives. There are many others, about 40 or 50 authentic memoir narratives by former slaves published before the Civil War. It's the, I say best because it's the best written. And it is now taught all over the world in many languages. It was out of print for a century. Till 1960, the first modern edition went back into print. And I mean, during the entire Jim Crow era, the only place you would have read, or you could have gotten it in libraries for sure, I think, most libraries. But the only place it was really taught in any significant way would have been black schools and black colleges, some black schools and black colleges. It was put back in print in 1960 by Benjamin Quarles, great black historian at Morgan State, by Harvard University Press. And then in the 60s, there were 2-3 more editions, and then more editions and more editions. And I have an edition out there too. Go ahead, adopt mine. But the Douglass narrative sticks as a teaching book. One, because it's short, but most importantly, it's a window into slavery. It's his own particularly personal window into slavery, but it's a coming of age story. That's why young readers are drawn to it, are stunned by it. I always tell my students to read it out loud to themselves in groups because it's written in a sermonic style, which is how Douglass learned language. So you're learning all kinds of things in that little book. You're learning about the black sermonic tradition. You're learning about writing. Douglass had an uncanny skill at a young age to find a metaphor to capture a whole world of meaning. But it is a story of the rise of a mind, of a mentality through pain, through oppression. A classic story of coming of age, a classic American story. It's very manipulative, but what memoir isn't? Now, so you're not just, if you ban that book, you're not just saying, oh, it's about slavery and it might make white people feel bad. White students love that book, and they learn something about the psychology, not just of being a slave, but of being a slave owner. A major theme of that book is Douglass's analysis of the master's mind. I mean, it's all over that book. He penetrates to that, and with a certain empathy. So there's so much, it's a work of literature. It can be read just for the style even. That's why it's so many, literature courses teach it. So I don't know if the people who put that book on the list would even talk to people like us. There could be a conversation. I could take them to passages. I could take them to metaphors in the book that take young people into whole worlds of understanding, which is what any important work of literature does. I suppose I have no idea how it got on that list. I suppose because, is it this issue that is going to make white kids feel bad? Is that this? Yeah, that's the essential reason for this. Yeah. Oy. I mean,
Oy is right.
yeah. No, I mean, there was an Oklahoma or was it Tennessee school system that banned the narrative too, at least for a while. Tennessee. Okay. Yeah. I mean, good Lord. Maybe my biography will get banned. It's good for sales, I think.
It'll be in banned book reading clubs throughout the nation, right? Keitha, your point about what do you do when the primary sources are banned? There's a key element here. Primary sources are rarely banned, right? It is, you can get them off the internet. It is to discourage teachers from teaching using primary sources that's the problem.
So the suggestion is to do what?
Education throughout history in this country, particularly Black history, teaching it has been an act of subversion. It is using the primary sources that we have access to because it does not violate state standards. It is actually in the state standards that teachers have to use primary sources to teach these topics. One of the questions that I have gotten that sort of underscores this: do you teach with the 1619 project? You know, and it's never a good faith question. Let's be honest. Okay.
That's a setup.
That's a setup. And, you know, I might have sound like I fell off the turnip truck, but I didn't. So my comment is, I do not teach with the 1619 project because it does nothing that I can't do more effectively and more directly than the primary sources themselves. Right? The understanding.
It also left out St. Augustine.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
Which is earlier than 1619, but we don't have to go there.
That's exactly right, and thus problematic. The other thing is, right, when you have experts in their field who form a work group to say that these are the standards, ask questions about who is on those groups. The evidence that they use to say slavery had benefits. Paraphrasing, when 16 of the examples listed as enslaved people who used slavery to their benefit, do your due diligence and do the research, and you'll find that of the 16, 9 were never enslaved. You'll learn that John Henry is a mythological figure. Yeah, John Henry laughs. You'll learn that George Washington's sister was neither enslaved nor Black.
It's like Eliza in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's fiction.
So
Character, but it's fiction.
Yeah, the primary sources and being able to think critically allows you to actually be a better teacher according to our own state standards. That's the importance, Ms. Nelson.
Go ahead.
You know, before we got up here, I asked you when we were talking about this conference, I said, what do you want people to come away from this conference with? What do you want them to know? And you said you want to equip our educators with the tools they need in order to navigate this system, these limitations that we're seeing. How can they? What can they do? How are we going to teach our children the truth in this climate?
That's a great question. And with each panel, I have taken away something that I did not know. And part of the element that I'm most proud of is bringing together a variety of different groups who all are facing the same restrictions and limitations and challenges, but we may be speaking different languages, right? I have learned from Dr. BLIGHT. And the reason that I'm proud to be on this stage with him, other than because of the obvious reasons, right? It's because he has a passion for these topics. And when we talked about this last year, it was because you're at a teaching institution and you're experiencing this on the front line. And as we've put together this conference, David has been adamant we need a panel with teachers. We need a panel with journalists. We need a panel with a variety of different constituencies so that we can all network and we can all learn together, right? So I think the most important, there are a lot of important things that I've learned, KEITHA. And I think one of the major things is don't self-censor. That the standards are there and they're telling us to do our jobs to the best of our abilities, and it's there in black and white. The primary sources allow us to teach to the best of our abilities in a way that is state sanctioned. The other thing I think that's really important is context. If we teach context, the way that someone receives that is beyond my control. I'm not trying to make someone feel guilty. I'm not trying to inspire them to change the world. The history is stronger than I am. The history will do the work for us, right? But it's also been really discouraging because the more I've learned about what we can do to do our jobs better and more effectively, the more I learned that the system has been sort of manipulated to exhaust our best teachers. And then all of a sudden you have a Prager video that you can use because you don't have time to plan. So there, all of these things have really worked together, and I've learned both what we can do, and I can also learn the tools that are being used to keep us from doing that, to maybe navigate those.
You don't really believe he doesn't want to change the world. Can I just say quickly? I mean, that's a tall order, brother. And
Yeah.
you're right. I agree with everything you said. But every teacher has to, at any level here. We had a panel of university teachers here who talked about self-censorship and who was the wonderful man from Florida A&M. I mean, yeah. I mean, he was trying to tell us how hard it is to navigate a black college and some of these issues right now. And, you know, he didn't kind of want to go there, but he did. Anyway, but I see Haley here. I mean, our panel of teachers yesterday, I don't know how if everyone else is here or not, but they all told us how difficult it is in their own circumstance. But every teacher, I think throughout the ages, but certainly now and certainly in Florida, has to find their own way within these restrictions, within these ridiculous demands, these perceptions that history ought to be making people feel good and making your kids walk out the door doing kumbaya. They all got to find their own way to be subversive. And I'm not saying that because I think history is always on the front line of changing the world. You know, sometimes it helps, it really does, but it sometimes is just a base of information and knowledge. But y'all got to navigate this in your own way. I mean, I did this when I was a teacher, but I had a lot of freedom too. I had I taught for a principal, and this is a key thing for teachers. Do they have leadership in their schools that supports them? And
Right.
And the answer is sometimes yes, and sometimes those administrators don't know what to do either. I taught for a principal who was an old Marine who didn't give a damn what we did inside the classroom as long as I kept peace in the hallway. Seriously, I don't want any rumbling in the hallway and you're into that hall. What do you do in your own classroom? It's just, I don't want to know what you do in your classroom. And he didn't, including when I got his son to rig actually, no, it was the assistant principal's son, to rig an on-off switch on the PA system. Because I hated those announcements. It interrupted my teaching. I mean, we'd get 15 minutes of show up here for the volleyball team. And I shut it off.
Getting off topic. It's time.
And I've always wondered,
Within
is that switch still there? Because school's closed, but anyway, you know, so you got to find your own ways to manipulate. But I wasn't facing these state restrictions on what it even means to do history. Although I did feel, I've always felt the broader American environment, and this is nothing new, the broader American environment is still this world in which people want to feel good about the past.
And that is not history. One of the things that this conference has reinforced for me is that when the general public says, I love history, they don't. They love nostalgia. There is a difference between nostalgia and history. Nostalgia satisfies what people who claim to love history want as the eventual outcome. So one of the things is being able to define the terms that are used and in digestible ways to make people think. I'm not here to tell you how to think. I'm here to ask you if you would like to. So nostalgia is what you really love. History is what you really despise. We need to do a better job of college educators, in my opinion, of making that distinction for our students. Because, yeah, students do have a range of emotions when they learn this history. And you know what eventually they come to? Anger. They are mad because they came to our classrooms and were never told about Frederick Douglass. They didn't know who Robert Hayling was. They did not understand that Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings between 1880 and 1930. And when they learn this, they don't get mad at me. They don't get mad at me. Right? So being able to have our, I don't want to say talking points, but to have our historical truths synthesized in a way that resonate in ways that we may never see is something that we need to be better at as professional educators.
Oh, just a tiny bit of pushback, brother.
Go
I like it. I like it. Go, go.
No, well, I don't tell them this, but bring me your nostalgia. It's a place to start. It's a place to start. If you're and some kids have grown up. I mean, you're lucky if some kids have grown up with their parents taking them to historic sites.
True.
Or museums. I love museums. Oh, I love this kind of history. And I love that. I have a student now. He's a senior. He's a really serious student, but he just grew up fascinated with presidential historical sites, like the president's houses. I said, really? Okay. And especially James K. Polk.
What?
Yeah. Polk's the only president, so far as we know of, who bought and sold slaves from the Oval Office. Anyway, but he's a serious history student now, but he came with this kind of weird nostalgia. I'll start with it. Whatever you got, bring it. I'll start with it.
Yeah.
And I may fail, but at least there's a place to
It's a
start.
place to
Your
start.
starting point's James K. Polk. My starting point, something that we read in Southern cultural history this week, and it was Parts Have Gone with the Wind. So different starting point.
Yeah, slightly.
We probably all taught particularly young women who grew up reading Gone. Well, maybe not anymore, but I used to have lots of young women students who had grown up reading Gone with the Wind. That's a place to start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what counts. Professor Blight, you are the president-elect of the Organization of American Historians. First, let's talk a little bit about what that is and how, if at all, perhaps at all, that you guys can help what we're seeing right now, help our educators.
Well, first of all, there are two big organizations of historians. There's lots of other associations. The AHA, the American Historical Association, and Jim Grossman, who's here, who's on panel this afternoon, is its executive director. The OAH is the Organization of American Historians. That's all U.S. historians. Some of you know this. AHA is much bigger. OAH, maybe 6,000 members. Maybe 3,000 come to our conventions if we're lucky, but it's all professional historians. However, that means teachers as well. Anybody in the business or the craft, and both organizations have categories of membership. Teachers have lower price memberships than senior faculty. We exist to promote and sustain scholarship, of course. But we exist as I would say, careful advocacy associations. The AHA, and Jim may say more about this afternoon, has already been involved on this issue with state legislatures. 20 of them, Jim, I think, and with other ways of reaching out to teachers. The OAH has a much smaller staff. I'm president-elect, but so I'm not actually president yet. I don't become president until whenever, next spring. And a president's only president for a year, but we have a series of programs going on. And hopefully this issue, and I'll say, and Jim can comment even better on this because he lives it every day. These organizations are, by definition, supposed to be nonpartisan. I mean, we can't be out there, wearing politics on our sleeves or we kind of lose authority. It's a classic, it's same with a college or a university in terms of taking official positions. But the AHA and the OAH do write letters on issues. The recent Moms for Liberty convention, or whatever they called it, they held in Philadelphia, we tried to take positions on that, not whether they had the right to meet, but what they were doing to teachers. Right, Jim? Threatening teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And these organizations have taken firm stands on LGBT rights over the years and a host of other issues. But there's always this careful need. And I was fascinated by the journalist yesterday from the New York Times, Kyle Spencer. Kyle, yeah. And her point about how the struggle of journalists, your field, to sustain a nonpartisan point of view on an issue like this.
Facts are the facts. That's
I
it.
know. Facts are
That's it.
facts. You're right. But I find right now more than any time in my life that, especially when you enter a role as in leadership of a major organization like this, and even our own center at Yale, which is small, but we take positions on certain things. Now, it's a little easier there because we're a center for the study of slavery and abolition. So, you know, if somebody is messing up and screwing up the history of slavery and abolition, I'm going to find a way to take a stand on that. Usually I do it, though, indirectly by writing an op-ed somewhere, you know, and I don't necessarily do it under the name of the center. But I have found Trumpism a challenge to this idea of facts are facts and will be nonpartisan more than anything else I've ever faced. And when journalists call, which they do, in fact, first it was the Confederate monuments issue and then Trump, and then everything flowed from that, from Charleston to Charlottesville, etc. When journalists call, I'm not nonpartisan anymore at all. I mean, how do you remain nonpartisan on an issue like attacks on teachers when it's being done, sorry, by one political party for the obvious purpose of the wedge issue of dividing people and frightening people over the nature of history? Well, we're in the history business. So it's difficult because an organization like AHA represents thousands of historians in all fields. And not every, despite what you hear, historians are not all flaming liberals. They're not all members of the Democratic Party. And that at the end of the day doesn't matter. And we'd love to disagree. Disagreement among historians is good for business, if you haven't noticed. That's what we do. And we believe in reinterpreting everything. So even the word revisionist, this goes way back. I mean, in the Bush years, they poll tested the word revisionist history when they were defending the war in Iraq. And God, and left and right do this. I mean, complaining about revisionist history. Do you want your doctor to not be a revisionist? I mean, come on.
Confederate monuments were the first examples, tangible examples of revisionism.
Well, true. I mean, and then you revise again, don't you? And you revise again, and you revise again, and you make choices. But it is incumbent, though, on professional organizations in any field. I mean, you have your own associations. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Professional organizations of journalists.
Yeah.
Trumpism has challenged you.
Everyone has. You have fake news.
I know.
All over the place. But
and you guys are under scrutiny all the time now about how do you cover this?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You ask the questions, and even though you know you're not getting the truth, you just keep on pegging away at it. Just keep on shoving. But we're gonna have to wrap up. But I do want to touch on this briefly because I saw a shirt in the audience that kind of speaks to this, and I want to get your take on this, both Professor Butler and Blight. So we've heard Governor DeSantis say time and time again, the new curriculum is written by scholars. We've all seen their names, know their backgrounds, but here's an excerpt that I'd like to hear your take on as a historian from all of this, from this curriculum. I'll teach, quote, how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. I'm going to start with you, Professor Blight, because we did see Frederick Douglass move on from slavery and become quite successful.
And I'll be dead honest with you on this one. This is the most ridiculous debate. No, it's one of the most ridiculous, a lot of ridiculous debates I've ever seen. First of all, the word skills and the word benefits are two separate ideas to me. The people benefit from slavery. It's not a word that applies. But ladies and gentlemen, of course, slaves learned, possessed skills as slaves. They built the country. They built the South. They knew how, they had the knowledge of how to build the trenches for rice production. They knew how to plant. They knew how to harvest. They became artisans of all kinds. I know somehow in your Florida debate, the idea of a blacksmith came up. Well, they might have come out of slavery as a blacksmith. Of course they did. Okay, fine. But they were all kinds of artisans. And believe me, if you will, we had 2 to 3 decades of scholarship, hundreds and hundreds of books written from the 1970s into the 90s in this in the revolution of slavery studies that demonstrated what Gene Genovese once called the world the slaves made, the world they made under oppression, and peoples all through history who have been either peasantries or enslaved people or exploited in one way or another, nevertheless learned and built and created. They created religion, they created music, for God's sake. Those are skills, big time. Now, I don't agree with the way that idea was being used, and I don't agree with the political impulse behind it. But this is such, and I've seen photographs of the protests in Florida, banners or posters. Slavery did not give anybody skills, and so yes, it did. But that's not to honor slavery. It's just reality. I mean, generations. You know how many generations of American slaves there were? They didn't just, as Nathan Huggins, one of my mentors, once said, African-American historian who had the audacity to hire me once, he said, look, the 4 million people who walked out of slavery at the end of the Civil War weren't all zombies. They were human beings. They had all kinds of skills. They had brains. And yes, Douglass learned, oh my God, I mean, he learned how to be a caulker in Baltimore, but he also learned how to preach by modeling preachers, and he learned how to read from the Bible and the Columbian Order and a whole bunch of other ways. He walked out of slavery not with the skill to write yet. That took time. He was already an orator. He had been practicing it for 3 and 4 years in brush arbors on the eastern shore of Maryland. And what's the first thing he did in New Bedford, Massachusetts? He went down to the local AME church and joined up, and within 6 months, they had him in the pulpit. He's 21 years old because they found, God, this kid can preach. You know, that's a skill. His training in homiletics was in slavery. So what do you do with that? We have so many false debates about this nonsense, but again, it's created from the right on language of their terms. Fight back against their language with the same language, but with knowledge. Sure. Sorry.
If I were cynical,
If you were cynical.
I would use Nat Turner as an example of a slave that did use certain elements and skills to his benefit. And that would open up a can of worms that I think were unintended from the work group. I think that this standard, glad you like that, David. I think that this demonstrates the power of history, a history-based, liberal arts-based education. And that is to ask questions beyond just that one blurb. Scholars did this. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. If you talk to people in that work group, there were 2 people who were, with all due respect, political operatives. Neither were experts in history. Neither were historians, formally trained historians. Okay, so there's that. Number 2, instead of asking what were the skills, what are we trying to stress there? Why is that necessary? Why are we stressing this element? And what is it really trying to develop? And it's trying to develop what is on one of my colleagues' shirts. Slavery did not benefit Black people. It obscures the fact.
I like the word benefit.
Yeah. It obscures the fact that as long as there has been enslavement in this country and before we were a country, there was resistance to slavery because of the autonomy of people, of human beings who resisted it in a variety of different ways at a variety of different times, including the ability to learn to read, including the ability to resist, if not rebel. So it opens up this Pandora's box that is trying to be contained with that statement, actually, which is something that as educators, we should be able to use to our benefit to have a much more substantive conversation about the who, what, where, when, the Kate Turabian so what question. And the so what gets us into the element that in the history of human enslavement, American slavery is unique in a variety of different ways. And despite those uniquenesses, the enslaved asserted their autonomy and their humanity in ways that are both tangible and untangible. So yeah, it's an exercise in critical thinking, right? And you know, you go beyond the standards and it's not just the beneficial aspect, but there are other things in that report that are equally troubling, including the concept of responsible citizenship. And for me, the concept of responsible citizenship is even more insidious than what we're talking about now, because responsible citizenship in that proposal has as its baseline following laws, respect for authority. How can you teach Rosa Parks and the concept of respectable citizenship simultaneously? So I use it as an exercise in critical thinking. I use it as a way of discussing the why is this an issue and what is it trying to obscure that is more important in understanding the history of this topic that is a direct consequence of the subversion against teaching truth.
I knew I was going to enjoy this. Okay. We're going to wrap up this portion. We do want to open up the stage really quickly for any of you who have questions out there in the audience, because I'm sure you do. Look what we have on the stage. It's so much fun. Deja, I believe, yes, she has a mic and she's going to come around to you all and see if you have any questions to ask of these two. I was really looking forward to this. I got to tell you, Mike, when you asked me, I said, what in the name alone? I was like, freedom to teach. Let's do this. You know what I mean? This is going to be great. And it really was. Let's go ahead. Please tell us your name if you can. And
It's about to be, I bet.
Hello.
there we go. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Laura Jeffries. I teach English at Florida State College at Jacksonville. And I wanted to connect something that the journalist yesterday talked about to something we talked about, you guys talked about earlier. Yesterday, the journalists, and maybe in another panel too, we were talking about not accepting the far right framing and terminology for certain things when it's transparently in bad faith, and not reusing some of their language and getting out of that framework. Something earlier in this morning's discussion, we were talking about the books and the lessons that are being banned or questioned because they will supposedly make white students feel bad. And I wanted to question whether that is a legitimate claim that we even need to respond to. Isn't the real fear that educating people, let's say between the ages of 16 and 25, about the truth of American history, isn't the real fear not that they'll feel bad, but that a group of educated young people will vote and change the circumstances on the ground in this nation? Isn't that what it's really about? And shouldn't we stop even responding to this sort of non-starter about making people feel bad?
The smirk on your face right now.
In other words, shouldn't we just go for the politics at the core of it than the actual argument they're making? Yeah, I think I agree with that. Mostly I do, because this is what this is. Now, are there parents who are legitimately worried that their sons and daughters might grow up with negative views of themselves, their past, their country, and so on? Yeah, they probably do. But again, our job is to, however we can, is to educate their children, but also those parents. It's a slow, miserable, often failing process. But I'm worried about those adult parents who think that history is for the purpose of pleasure. It is pleasurable. I love being in an archive all day. I love reading history all day if I can. I would do that every day if I could. But look, I don't know who first said it, but history is politics by other means. Now, we don't always want to say that because we're scholars. We want to lead with our evidence, and we should. You better have your evidence in line, before you put some ideology in your writing. And my favorite historians of all time, my models have always been those historians who do have a little bit of ideology, but you got to look hard to find it. It's just very convincing history with great research. Okay, we want to lead with that. But this is about the politics of knowledge. It's about the politics of education. It's about the politics of history. It's about who owns history and what is it at the end of the day. And we as historians and teachers and the whole enterprise here, all the organizations that have come to this conference, our business has an authority of continuing to tell people what history is. We shouldn't be shy. We shouldn't apologize for using words like truth. Actually, the word truth wasn't used nearly as much before Trumpism. We should be afraid of the word truth. Oh God, we were all trained in graduate school. There is no ultimate truth. There's no truth. There's no truth. By God, sometimes you find some truth and you have a right to say it. Not all truths are equal. Not all falsehoods are unequal. And maybe a last little point about the benefits business. What if primary documents were banned? Because they may be now in certain ways. You just don't have access. Just one little example from Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Claims Commission was one of the first things ever created by the federal government to actually interview ex-slaves about their lives. And they were invited to Washington and even elsewhere to make claims for their property that the Union Army had confiscated. Things like tools, wagons, hogs, and on and on and on. And out of that amazing array of documents, we learned that a lot of enslaved people had their own gardens, had their own implements, had their own possessions, had their own skills, and they went to the government and said, "You owe me for this." Now, to say they had no skills is an insult to them. And I could go on, but I won't.
No, that's, again, profound. Yeah, I think that the emphasis on guilt comes from a place of fear, because students do sometimes feel guilty about the history that we expose. Not that we're making them feel guilty or making them denounce their race or whatever the case may be out of these manufactured boogeyman, straw man arguments, right? Again, I'll go back to Vietnam, Ms. Nelson. We went through an exhibit at the War Remnants Museum that was called the Hall of Atrocities. And it was, the emphasis was on what the colonizers did to the Vietnamese. It's photographic, it's documented, and students left saying, I felt guilty because I didn't know this. They're not guilty because they feel some sort of individual responsibility. They feel guilt and shame because they didn't know it. And the fear in that realization that people who are weaponizing that word understand is, once you feel guilty, history is different than processing the stages of grief, because at the end, with history, you're determined to do something about it. And doing something about it is mobilizing. It's making sure that the next generation, what motivates me, the next generation is more educated than I was at their age, and that I use my vote to make sure that school board elections, the local elections that we often say don't matter, which are actually determined by just a handful of votes, that we are active participants in. So yeah, the guilt is used as a weapon against the point of students realizing that they're guilty because of what they didn't know, what they haven't done, and are resolute to not be in that space here moving forward.
Yeah, go ahead. Deja, I believe you have another person over there.
My name is Bernadette Bennett. I'm the former social studies specialist for Sarasota County Schools. In Sarasota County Schools, we did not adopt elementary textbooks for 20 years in social studies.
I'm sorry, I didn't fully.
Did I hear you say former?
Yes,
What happened?
I retired.
Okay.
We did not adopt social studies textbooks for 20 years. We fought and begged for those books for our elementary teachers. But because of things like No Child Left Behind that minimalized the social studies curriculum over reading,
Mhm.
the social studies books were replaced with reading books that had a story once in a while that had a historical context. We had a Teaching American History grant, and that Teaching American History grant allowed us the opportunity to work not only with high school and middle school teachers, but elementary school teachers to learn how to build curriculum. How do you build resources to work with elementary students? We had to weaponize our standards, even back then, to teach social studies. And so what we did was we took standards like our traditional American history standards, and we used things like required instruction, and we combined them to build units and to build teaching pieces that were impenetrable from that outside piece. So if you take African-American history, the broad standard that's listed throughout the high school social studies and middle school social studies curriculums, and you pair it with something like the required instruction for African-American history, and then you pair it with the veterans' history, and you pair it with the Medal of Honor history, and you combine that and focus on the African-American experience throughout, you're able to bring in all of those pieces. But teachers need help building this. Teachers need to be able to list their primary sources on their syllabus before they use them with students, or share those resources to parents as you're building a unit, because you're going to be teaching it, so they're able to read the primary sources and make sure that their students, their child, the parent's child, can participate in that lesson. It's arduous.
Yeah.
And we need help. Teachers need help. How do we help them build these resources to work with our kids? Because right now, I believe still in Sarasota County, if you're going to use a primary source, it has to be one that's listed in your state adopted textbook. You cannot go outside your state adopted textbook without notifying parents. How do we help teachers get there?
That's great. I love that. Getting creative. That's what you were saying earlier. That's what you have to do, but it's difficult, clearly.
For me, it's asking the teachers what they need to start with. And that is one of the things that I've learned. You know, it's easy for us as the ivory tower scholars to look down our nose from on top and say, this is what you need to do. One of the things that I've learned, and you've just educated me on that, is that we need to address these standards using these primary sources. How can we do it? Being exposed to the problem is part of the path to helping address the issue. This is where we bring in people like incoming president of OAH and AHA to say, okay, this is an issue. This is something that we can do. It's connecting, it's sharing resources, and it's putting the people in contact who are much more connected and smarter than I am to help you accomplish that. So I think that's the first step, is as trite as that may sound.
Well, you're right, but and correct me if I'm wrong, man, but it sounds like the nub here is a political problem. If you can't go outside a required set of standards to find a single primary document, which could be anything, a speech by so-and-so, that's a system-wide political problem. Maybe this is why we have to get involved with legislatures and superintendents. And this is not easy. This is hard. This is very difficult. You know, here's a little tiny model that may or may not fit. But for years, the OAH, the thing I'm gonna be heading, had a program for maybe 10 years, Jim, I think, where the OAH sent out 3 historians at a time to national park history sites, not schools, but sites, especially Civil War sites, but a lot of other sites. And we'd go in and we'd spend 2 days examining everything they do, how they interpret it. We weren't always that welcome, but we did it. I did 2 of them at Civil War battlefield sites. And then we wrote up these elaborate reports, and I think we were very respectful. But the whole idea was to help the people on the ground reinterpret some sites that hadn't been interpreted in ever. Maybe AHA, OAH, and other kinds of historian organizations need to think in those terms. Maybe funding is always an issue, but maybe we could, in fact, that I think was done in cooperation with Gilder Lehrman, I think. But at any rate, maybe we need to think about this. Teams of 3 historians who would go, you'd invite them, and you might not be popular for doing it, but bring in some people. On the other hand, how we're going to confront that political problem of the curricular demands you live within is something I don't know yet. I mean, that's from the legislature down to your administrations and whoever is inventing these curriculums. I mean, give us those people who invented that curriculum in a room where we can lock the doors. Yeah, and promise not to be violent. But I don't know. I mean, you asked a very hard question, because you're living within a set of restrictions that are essentially impossible if you want to be a creative teacher. And if I heard you right, the idea here that social studies had just fallen off the table in favor of something else. There you go. Yeah, I mean, you don't need that anymore. It's all about math and reading, isn't it? Math and reading, and then some STEM. Social study, history is what's lost when social studies goes over the cliff.
One of the things I've learned from this event is that we need to pay closer attention to the rule book. And what I mean by that is that we have learned yesterday in several panels that the quiet part, which is expressed loudly, is there's one group that says we don't focus on the end result. If we don't like who's elected, we change the election template. So the rule book is what we need to do a better job of paying attention of as this stuff is in committee and subcommittee. And, you know, maybe we need to become, I need to become a bit more of a policy hack than I thought I ever would be, because the depressing point is that that is the intended outcome of these restrictions. And by the time you have that and have your planning period taken away and have a class of 40 students, then the damage is already done. We need, if those are the rules that get us there, we need to do a better job of rewriting the rules and paying attention to the rule book as it's being constructed. And that's on us.
You know, the thing is as well is that because we report on these things, these subtle changes as they're happening, but people don't tend to pay attention until it's like, whoa, wait, this was happening? I didn't know about this. Yes, you did. We wrote about it. We told you about it. You just weren't really paying attention until things, it takes a crisis. It takes it to get to where we are now, where we are now.
Mm.
Any other questions out there?
We're about 10 minutes over, so I
Oh.
don't know. If we want to do maybe 2 more questions,
Okay, okay.
One in the middle, if we can keep them, well, succinct is hard around historians, I know that. but-
Good morning. Ralph Rice, University of Florida, retired. I wrote down a couple of things that you mentioned. The state sponsors what we can teach, violate state standards, state restrictions, and then just recently state adopted textbooks. Mike, you mentioned about the seminar being canceled, but my impression is that was outside the classroom. So now we have Flagler, Yale, Duke, private institutions. We understand the challenges of public institutions. How much and what type of pressure do you feel being a private institution with a little bit more leeway than the public?
That's a great question. And, you know, the thing that we were talking about, Ralph, was that cancellation was never on the table for this event. You know, so the way that it's been explained to me, and that's a question that has come up often as we planned this event, is that, wait a minute, I thought Flagler College was a private institution. And the way that it was explained to me was that that's both a blessing and a curse, because not just Flagler, but all private institutions in Florida are tuition dependent. So there are a variety of factors there. The relationship between our trustees, our admin, and our faculty is much more intimate than it is at often the impersonal state institutions. And we therefore do depend on a lot of state funding for us to keep the buildings as beautiful as they are, right? So the blessing is that I have an admin who believe in academic freedom. And we're here and we're talking about these things. The curse is that we still have to worry about what the ramifications of our academic freedom may be on the institution's future hard stop financially. So in a way, there is a benefit to being a private institution. And there's also that detriment of, because we are not Duke or Yale, that we are more financially dependent on many of the appropriations that we quite frankly need. That's the fine line that we walk as an institution. And I hope that makes sense. And that's not, you know, there is a recognition of, a very conscious recognition that academic freedom here is valued. You're here. But also a recognition of, this can't be what many non-good faith actors on the outside claim academia is, which is a bunch of bomb-throwing left-wing radicals that are getting together to just crap on the system. That's not who we are. That's not what we're here to do. So to see a word like nonpartisan in the conference description seems to be odd, but it's vital because of our status as a private institution.
Let's take one more. We're done. Okay. I'm so sorry. We have to wrap up. We're like 15 over now. Are we going to allow one more? Is that? Uh-oh, back and forth. No more. Okay. I'm so sorry. But I hope you guys enjoyed yourselves. I want to do just one last word, if we can, from both Professor BLIGHT as well as Butler, just to wrap things up, because we do appreciate you guys being out here this morning. One last word.
You go first. Never forget why you got into this business. Intellectual curiosity, making the world a better place than the one you inherited.
Trust the teacher.
Thank you guys for being here this morning. I hope you enjoyed yourselves as much as I did. Have a great one.